There are times when history feels less like a record of truth and more like a carefully woven fabric, stitched together to hide as much as it reveals. We are told of the great civilizations that rose and fell, of their kings, their wars, their monuments. But between those well-lit chapters lies a silence that feels intentional, a silence where entire centuries seem to fade into shadow. And within that silence, some say, are the whispers of an empire that once ruled, flourished, and left behind traces too strong to fully vanish, yet too dangerous to be remembered. It begins in fragments, old maps that seem to show coastlines and cities where none should exist, monuments that stand alone, their scale and design unmatched by the cultures surrounding them. Legends that speak of a kingdom of power, but always in tones of caution, as if uttering the name itself is forbidden. This is not the kind of forgetting that happens with time. It is the kind of erasure that comes with intention, as though someone, somewhere decided that this empire was never meant to survive in the human record. And yet, traces remain. They linger like faint fingerprints smudged across the pages of time. A temple aligned so perfectly with the stars that it belongs to no known culture. A road that begins in the middle of nowhere, leading to nothing, yet crafted with precision, suggesting it once connected worlds now lost. A half-forgotten text, written in a language barely understood, speaking of kings who ruled lands no map dares to hold. Every trace feels like a ghost reaching out of the silence, reminding us that something is missing. Why would an empire be erased? Why would history choose silence over memory? The answers are not simple. Power fears rivals, even long after they are gone. To erase a name is to erase its claim. To deny its existence is to deny its glory. Perhaps this empire was not conquered but covered up. Perhaps its memory threatened the legitimacy of those who came after. Perhaps it challenged the story of humanity itself, and so the safest choice was silence. Still, silence has a way of drawing attention. The more it covers, the more the mind wonders what lies beneath. And that is why erased empires still haunt us. They haunt us not with their presence, but with their absence, with the unanswerable questions they leave behind, with the unease that our history is not complete, that our story is not what we've been told. Even now the whispers continue, in the stones, in the ruins, in the myths that refuse to die. They call out to us, asking if we are ready to listen, asking if we dare to peel back the layers and face the truth of what has been hidden. And though their words are faint, though their stories are fragmented, the feeling they leave is undeniable. Something vast once stood where now there is only silence. Something powerful enough to shape the world, something that someone, somewhere, tried very hard to make us forget. Every so often, evidence appears in the world that refuses to fit the neat boxes of our timelines. A broken wall in a desert, carved with symbols no local culture can explain. A road of stone running straight for miles through wilderness, its edges smoothed by hands long vanished. A city beneath the sands, revealed by shifting winds, built with skill that seems to belong to no people we know. These fragments emerge like voices speaking out of the dark, whispering of an empire that should not exist. We are told that history is complete, that the record of humanity moves in a straight line, first tribes, then villages, then kingdoms, then empires, step by step, a ladder of progress. But what if that ladder is missing rungs? What if there was once a civilization so vast, so powerful, that when it collapsed, later rulers chose not to remember it, its ruins scattered, its name erased, its legacy rewritten into the myths of others, and yet the stones still tell a different story? In South America, there are fortresses built with blocks so massive they defy modern engineering. Locals say they were not the work of the Incas, but of those who came before, a people whose name has long been lost. In Africa, vast earthworks stretch for hundreds of miles, too vast for the small tribal societies that historians assign to them. In Asia, there are temples carved into mountainsides, their artistry suggesting centuries of accumulated knowledge, but with no sign of the slow evolution that should have led to them. It is as though the empire appeared fully formed, left its mark, and vanished without warning. Even in Europe, anomalies abound. Megaliths older than recorded history stand in fields and on coastlines, their purpose mysterious, their alignments impossibly precise. Who built them? The official record offers guesses, but the truth is harder to ignore. They suggest a people organized enough, advanced enough to shape landscapes with intent. A people who do not fit into the story we have been given. And then there are the myths, legends of golden cities swallowed by the earth, tales of rulers who commanded the stars, of lands that thrive beyond the horizon, ancient texts that speak of kingdoms whose names do not appear in any history book. If they were inventions, why do they repeat across cultures oceans apart? Why does every people seem to remember an empire that should not exist? Perhaps it is because it did exist. Perhaps its memory lingers in the ruins, in the stories, in the silence itself. The empire that should not exist is not a fantasy, it is the shadow cast by fragments too solid to ignore. And though history has tried to bury it, every ruin that defies explanation, every myth that speaks too loudly of the past, every artifact that arrives centuries before its time, is another reminder. Something vast once stood here, something powerful, something that refuses to be forgotten no matter how hard history tries to erase it. Across the centuries, cartographers bent over parchment and vellum, their quills tracing the edges of the known world. Most maps are imperfect reflections of their age. Distorted coastlines, misplaced rivers, seas that stretch too wide. But scattered among them are anomalies. Maps that show lands no one should have known, coastlines drawn centuries before official discovery, mountain ranges charted with uncanny precision. These are the maps that remember, and they whisper of a civilization erased. One of the most haunting examples is the Piri Reis map, created in the early 1500s by an Ottoman admiral. It depicts not only the coast of South America, newly explored at the time, but also a section of Antarctica, centuries before it was officially discovered. Stranger still, the map shows Antarctica free of ice, as it would have appeared thousands of years ago. Scholars claim coincidence, a mistake of copying. But how could a sailor of the Renaissance have knowledge of a land hidden under ice for millennia? Unless he was drawing from older charts, fragments handed down from a forgotten empire. Other maps tell similar tales. The Orontius Phineus map of 1531, the Zeno map of 1558, the Dulcet map of 1339, each holds details that defy their age. Rivers in Africa not yet explored, coastlines of the Americas long before Columbus, even the mysterious Vinland map suggesting Norse voyages far earlier than admitted. If these were errors, they are strangely consistent. If they were fabrications, why do they match what modern satellites reveal? The simplest answer is also the most unsettling. These maps were copies of older originals, drawn in a time before history began, preserved in fragments, and later rediscovered. The question then becomes, who drew the first maps? We are told cartography advanced only with the Greeks, that the ancients lacked the knowledge to chart the world. But the accuracy of these anomalies suggests something else. A people who sailed vast oceans, who knew the shape of continents, who measured the earth with skill equal to our own. A people whose memory was buried, whose empire was erased, but whose maps survived hidden in libraries and monasteries until later ages stumbled upon them. If the maps are real, then the implications are staggering. They mean our ancestors were not isolated tribes stumbling through darkness. They were navigators, scientists, builders of ships and keepers of knowledge. They crossed seas long before Columbus, long before Magellan. They knew the world as a whole when others believed it flat and small, and when their empire vanished, they left behind these fragments, preserved in whispers of ink. The maps that remember do not shout their truth. They linger quietly, dismissed by scholars, hidden in archives, explained away as coincidence. But when you trace their lines, when you compare them to what we know now, the silence grows heavy. Someone, long before our history begins, charted the world. someone new, and that knowledge, like the empire that carried it, was never meant to survive. Across deserts, jungles, and mountains stand ruins that seem to belong nowhere in time. They rise with precision and grandeur, their stones cut so perfectly they lock without mortar, their walls aligned with the heavens, their scale far beyond the means of the societies to which historians assign them. These are ruins out of time, monuments that refuse to obey the story we have been told. In the highlands of Peru lies Sacsayhuaman, a fortress built with stones so massive that even today, with cranes and machines, their movement would test us. The blocks are fitted so tightly that a knife cannot slip between them. We are told the Incas built this marvel, yet the Incas themselves spoke of earlier builders, a race of giants or gods who came before. Was this merely myth, or was it memory? An echo of a civilization erased, leaving behind stones too heavy to deny. Far across the ocean, in Baalbek, Lebanon, rests another enigma. There, beneath Roman ruins, lie 3 colossal blocks known as the Trilithon, each weighing hundreds of tons. Modern engineers admit that moving them today would be nearly impossible, yet they sit perfectly placed, as though part of an older platform upon which later civilizations built. Who moved these stones? Who had the knowledge and the strength to create a foundation so immense only to vanish into silence? Egypt too hides its contradictions. The Great Pyramid stands as a wonder, unmatched by any pyramid that followed. Its precision, its alignment, its sheer scale suggests mastery of mathematics and engineering. And yet, rather than evolving into greater achievements, later pyramids are smaller, cruder, collapsing into rubble. Why would the first attempt be perfection and every later effort a decline? Unless the Great Pyramid was not a beginning but the remnant of a forgotten empire standing defiantly against time. In Asia, the story repeats. At Angkor in Cambodia, temples sprawl across miles, their carvings so intricate, their designs so advanced that historians struggle to explain how such a site arose suddenly in the jungle. At Ellora in India, temples are carved directly from mountainsides, entire complexes chiseled out of solid rock. To accomplish this would have required knowledge, tools, and centuries of effort. Yet the records are vague, the origins shrouded as if the builders slipped out of history as suddenly as they entered it. Even in Europe, the ruins speak. Stonehenge stands as a circle of megaliths aligned with the solstices, its purpose mysterious, its builders unknown. It appears as though placed by hands that understood the cycles of the heavens far better than their supposed era allows. And beneath the seas more ruins await. The Yonaguni structures off Japan, stair-like terraces swallowed by water, their origin fiercely debated. Natural formation, some say, yet their geometry, their precision feels human, and if they are human, they belong to a time far earlier than history permits. These ruins do not fit, they do not belong, and yet they remain silent monuments to an empire erased. Their stones do not care for the dates assigned to them. They remember what history has forgotten. And though we walk among them with awe and confusion, they whisper of a power that once was, a power that built, endured, and was buried not by time, but by choice. In dusty libraries, in monasteries where the light of candles barely reaches the shelves, there lie chronicles that tell a story few dare to read aloud. Ancient texts copied and recopied through the centuries sometimes slip strange details between their lines, references to kingdoms with no place on the map, rulers whose names do not appear anywhere else, wars fought against enemies we are told never existed. These are the forbidden chronicles, the fragile remnants of memory that survive the erasure of an empire. One manuscript describes a land to the west, rich in grain and gold, where kings ruled for centuries before vanishing in fire. Another speaks of journeys across seas, arriving at shores with cities built of stone larger than any in Europe at the time. Still others record lineages of dynasties that seem to stretch beyond the accepted timelines, monarchs reigning for centuries longer than mortal lives would allow. Were these exaggerations, or were they the last faint notes of a kingdom someone tried to erase? The Codex Regius of Iceland, a collection of Norse poems, whispers of ages before known history, of worlds and empires that rose and fell in a rhythm older than the Vikings themselves. The Mayan codices, those that survived the flames of the Spanish conquest, hint at calendars and histories spanning thousands of years, far beyond the neat limits of our history books. Even the Greek historians, Herodotus among them, spoke of lands beyond the edges of the known world, kingdoms whose power was spoken of with awe, yet never fully placed. What makes these chronicles so haunting is not only what they say, but how they are treated. Many have been locked away, dismissed as myth or forgery, explained away as fantasy. Entire libraries were burned to ash, Alexandria most famously, but countless others too, each fire erasing memories that did not fit the story rulers wished to tell. And yet, despite the destruction, fragments survived, enough to hint at something larger, enough to suggest that memory was deliberately rewritten. The silence of scholars is telling. When confronted with texts that do not align with accepted timelines, explanations are swift. Translation errors, misinterpretations, the imagination of storytellers. But beneath their dismissals lies unease. Why do so many cultures speak of lost kingdoms, vanished empires, lands beyond the horizon? Why do their stories converge when they were never meant to? Perhaps because the chronicles are not fiction, but memory. Perhaps they are the only surviving voices of those who lived in the shadow of a forgotten empire. Voices reduced to myth, scrubbed from the official record, yet too stubborn to vanish completely. The Forbidden Chronicles remind us that history is not merely what was written, it is also what was destroyed, what was silenced, what was hidden away. And when we turn their pages, we hear whispers that echo from the margins of time, telling us of a kingdom too great to forget, too dangerous to remember, and too important to leave entirely erased. For centuries, scholars have presented history as a story already settled, neatly arranged, carefully dated, each event following the last in an unbroken chain. To question it is to challenge not only facts, but the very authority of those who guard them. And yet, within the silence of academia, there lingers an unease. In the margins of manuscripts, in the ruins that do not fit, in the anomalies dismissed too quickly, are traces of a kingdom that should not exist. But rather than confront them, scholars often choose silence. Why? Because to acknowledge these traces is to open a door that cannot easily be closed. If one empire has been erased, if centuries have been misplaced, then what else might be false? Every carefully built timeline could unravel, every certainty dissolve. Careers would falter, textbooks would crumble, entire institutions would be forced to admit they have built knowledge upon foundations less stable than they claimed. Silence then becomes easier than confession. We see it in archaeology. A stone tool found where it should not be, older than the civilization assigned to it, is labelled an anomaly and placed aside. A ruin whose architecture surpasses its supposed builders is explained as coincidence, or credited to later repair. Artifacts that challenge the timeline are often locked in museum basements, unstudied, unpublished, forgotten. To question them is to risk ridicule, to be branded a dreamer chasing fantasies. And so most scholars turn away. We see it in history as well. Manuscripts that mention kingdoms not on the official map are filed under mythology. Genealogies that stretch too far are said to be poetic exaggerations. Maps that show lands unknown are brushed aside as misinterpretations. Every explanation bends toward preserving the accepted story, no matter how strained. And in the process, the traces of a forgotten empire fade once more into silence. This is not always born of malice. Scholars, like all people, fear the unknown. To question too deeply is to risk exile from one's peers, to lose grants, to stand alone in a field that punishes dissent. Safer then to guard the narrative, to defend the official story, to leave the whispers of lost empires to storytellers and dreamers. And yet, the silence of scholars is itself a kind of confession. It admits that something is there, too fragile to acknowledge, too dangerous to accept, but too persistent to fully deny. If the traces were meaningless, they would not need dismissal. If the ruins and texts were nothing, they would not inspire such defense. The silence tells us what words cannot, that something waits in the shadows of history, and that those who claim to be its guardians cannot face it. The empire they tried to erase still leaves its fingerprints. In the cracks between accepted facts, in the ruins that speak louder than the books, in the anomalies scholars pretend not to see. And as long as silence remains the chosen response, the mystery will only deepen. For silence is not the absence of truth, it is its shadow. Across cultures, across centuries, there are stories of lands beyond the horizon, lands so distant and so strange that they shimmer between myth and memory. Some were said to lie across vast deserts where no caravan dared to travel. Others beyond endless oceans, past the edge of maps. These are the kingdoms whispered of in fireside tales, half believed by travellers, dismissed by scholars, yet too persistent to be invention. Legends of a kingdom beyond the horizon, perhaps the last faint memory of the empire that was meant to be erased. In the sagas of the Norse there are stories of Vinland, a fertile land across the western seas, rich with grapes and forests. Official history allows this as far as a Viking foothold in North America. But the sagas also speak of encounters with great cities, with peoples far more advanced than the tribes historians describe. Were these embellishments, or glimpses of a civilization that no longer exists? In Africa, across the sands of the Sahara, tales speak of golden cities hidden in the dunes, cities that traders claim to glimpse but never reach. Timbuktu became a symbol of this dream, but the legends stretch further still, to kingdoms swallowed by the desert long before European maps reached them. Did the desert erase them, or did history itself choose to forget? The Chinese too told stories of kingdoms far across the oceans. Ancient records speak of voyages to lands where the people wore different clothes, where the stars looked different, where the riches of the earth seemed without end. Some scholars claim these were misinterpretations of Southeast Asia or Africa, but the descriptions bear details of lands we cannot easily place, lands that do not fit the world as it was supposed to be. Even in South America, myths remember. The Inca spoke of Viracocha, a great teacher who came from across the sea bringing knowledge and lore. They said he departed again, vanishing into the horizon, promising one day to return. Who was he? A god, a myth, or the last echo of travellers from a lost empire that spanned seas long before Columbus ever dreamed of them? What makes these legends powerful is their persistence. They appear in cultures separated by oceans, yet they tell the same kind of story. Of a kingdom far away, rich, powerful, and often destined to vanish. The details vary, but the theme remains. Somewhere beyond sight there was once a land greater than their own, a land erased from memory, yet carried forward in whispers. To dismiss all of this as fantasy is to ignore the consistency. Fantasy does not spread so far, does not repeat itself so faithfully across civilizations that never met. These stories are not accidents. They are fragments of a truth we are not meant to remember, a truth of a kingdom that once stood beyond the horizon, watching, trading, ruling, until it was erased. The horizon is not empty, it is a veil. Beyond it lies the memory of a kingdom that was taken from us, hidden in silence, lingering only in the myths that would not die. And when we hear these stories, we are not listening to imagination, we are listening to the faint echoes of a world that was once real. Beneath shifting dunes and layers of stone, entire cities lie entombed in silence. The desert buries quickly, swallowing walls and palaces in a tide of sand that grows heavier with each century. To walk across those endless landscapes is to tread upon the roofs of forgotten worlds, civilizations hidden just out of sight, their streets still waiting beneath the weight of time. These buried cities are not simply curiosities of archaeology. They are reminders of how easily history can vanish, how quickly an empire can be erased until only the desert remembers. In the sands of Egypt, ruins stretch far beyond the shadow of the pyramids. Archaeologists uncovered temples buried to their rooftops, avenues of sphinxes hidden for millennia, entire towns lost beneath drifting dunes. Some appear to belong to dynasties known, others to times unnamed, their origins obscured by silence. If so much lies still buried in a land so studied, how much more remains hidden in deserts unsearched? Further west, in the Sahara, satellite images reveal ghostly outlines, grids of streets, walls and enclosures, entire settlements swallowed by sand. Oral traditions of the Tuareg and Berber peoples speak of lost cities, kingdoms swallowed in a single night by desert winds. Some dismiss these as legend, yet the ground tells another story. Beneath the endless dunes lie traces of a world that once flourished, now erased not only by nature but by the silence of history. In the Middle East, the ruins of cities like Ubar, the so-called Atlantis of the sands, remind us of how myth and memory intertwine. For centuries, explorers doubted its existence, until its crumbled towers were uncovered beneath desert stone. If one city once dismissed as legend proves real, how many others, whispered of in forgotten texts, still sleep beneath the earth? Even in the Americas, deserts conceal mysteries. In Peru, beneath layers of sand, lie geoglyphs and ceremonial complexes so vast they can only be seen from the sky. These works speak of a civilization both advanced and enigmatic, one that vanished into silence before European contact. Why did they fall? Why were they forgotten? And why do their ruins still pulse with a sense of deliberate concealment? The pattern repeats, flourishing cities, swallowed overnight, their memory reduced to whispers. And when they are rediscovered, scholars scramble to explain them within the framework of history already written. Dates are adjusted, builders reassigned, myths labelled as coincidence. Yet the ruins themselves resist these explanations. Their stones are older than they should be, their construction too precise for their assigned cultures. They feel as though they belong not to the history we know, but to a parallel one, the history of the empire we were not meant to remember. The desert is both destroyer and preserver. It erases, yet it also protects. Beneath its shifting sands, walls still stand, pottery still lies where it was left, scripts still wait to be read. The silence of these cities is not final, it is a pause that ends each time the wind uncovers a corner of a wall, each time a satellite reveals a shadow of streets beneath the surface. And when these buried cities are revealed, they remind us of what has been lost, not just bricks and mortar, but memory itself. Civilizations that once thrived, erased from history, yet still whispering beneath the sand, waiting for the day their silence will be broken. All across the world, stories speak of fire from the skies and waters that rose without warning, tales of cities consumed in a single night, of kingdoms swallowed by waves, of empires burned to ash under a storm of flame. To most scholars, these are myths, allegories for moral lessons or natural fears, but their persistence across cultures suggests something more. The vanishing in fire and flood may not be mere imagination, it may be the final memory of how entire civilizations were erased. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh describes a great deluge that swept across the land, sparing only a chosen few. Centuries later, the same story appears in the Hebrew Bible as Noah's flood, told again in slightly different form. The Greeks spoke of Deucalion and Pyrrha, who survived when Zeus drowned the earth. In India, Manu was warned of a flood by a divine fish and built a vessel to save life. Are these simply coincidences? Or are they fractured recollections of a single cataclysm passed down in memory long after the empire it destroyed was forgotten? Water is not the only destroyer remembered. In Central America, the Maya and Aztec spoke of worlds ending in fire, of suns consumed, of cities falling when the heavens rained flame. Native American tribes told of skies darkened by smoke, of fire sweeping across plains until nothing remained. Even in the Mediterranean, legends linger of Phaethon losing control of the sun chariot, scorching the earth before plunging into the sea. To us these are myths, but perhaps they are poetic memories of cosmic events, comets, meteors, eruptions, that erased whole civilizations from time. Archaeology offers unsettling hints. In layers of soil across the globe, scientists find black mats, thin lines of carbon dating to around the same periods myths describe cataclysm. In some sites, microscopic diamonds, formed only under intense heat, appear scattered like invisible scars. In others, evidence of sudden flooding overlays the ruins of thriving settlements. Were these the signatures of the disasters remembered in myth? And if so, whose cities did they consume? The most haunting part is not just the destruction but the silence that followed. These disasters may not have simply ended civilizations. They may have provided the perfect cover for their erasure. Survivors might have remembered the empire that fell, telling stories of fire and flood. But later rulers, shaping history for their own ends, may have let those stories drift into myth, severing them from the names of the cities and kings they once described. To vanish in flood or fire is to vanish suddenly, without time for chronicles or monuments to preserve the truth. Yet memory clings stubbornly, reshaping itself into legend, carrying whispers across centuries. And so, when we hear these stories, we are not just hearing allegories, we are hearing fragments of memory of an empire erased, remembered only through the catastrophe that ended it. The vanishing in fire and flood haunts us because it feels too real, too universal. Different tongues, different lands, but always the same themes. Something was destroyed, something was lost. And though its name is gone, the silence that followed still lingers, carried in myths that refuse to die. Across every civilization, mythology shimmers with gods who ruled, heroes who conquered, and beings who walked among mortals before vanishing into legend. We are told these figures were inventions, symbols to explain nature, morality, or the unknown. Yet when the same patterns of gods and heroes repeat across cultures oceans apart, the question arises, were they really divine myths, or distorted memories of kings and rulers from an empire erased? In Greece, Zeus sat upon Olympus, ruling with thunder, while his brothers governed the sea and the underworld. In Mesopotamia, Anu ruled the heavens, Enlil the earth, and Enki the waters. In Mesoamerica, the gods Quetzalcoatl and Tezcatlipoca battled for dominion of the world. Different names, different forms, but the same architecture of power, pantheons of rulers dividing domains as kings divide kingdoms. Perhaps these myths were not inventions of the imagination, but memories of dynasties so ancient they were later mistaken for gods. The same can be said of heroes. Gilgamesh of Uruk, said to be 2/3 divine, ruled as a mighty king who sought immortality. Achilles, son of a goddess, led warriors in battle, his legend surpassing the man beneath. Even in Celtic lore, figures like Cuchulainn perform feats that blend the human and the supernatural. These echoes may be more than archetypes. They may be the glorified memories of rulers whose power and deeds were so great that later generations could only explain them by calling them divine. In Egypt, pharaohs were not simply kings. They were gods on earth, embodiments of Horus, sons of Ra. Their reign was divine by decree, their monuments eternal. Was this belief born purely of faith, or did it preserve an older truth? That rulers of a forgotten empire were once revered as beings beyond human, their knowledge and power mistaken for divinity. Even stranger are the similarities in myths of culture bringers, figures who arrive from nowhere, teach humanity the arts of civilization, and then depart. In Mesopotamia, Oans emerged from the sea, teaching writing, farming, and law. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl brought knowledge before sailing away on a raft of serpents. In Polynesia, the demigod Maui pulled islands from the sea and gave humans fire. Were these simply myths, or stories of emissaries from an empire that stretched across oceans, spreading knowledge before vanishing into silence? The pattern is clear. Gods who ruled like kings, kings remembered as gods, heroes whose exploits echo across continents. Mythology may not be fantasy at all. It may be the fractured memory of the empire they tried to erase, filtered through generations until the rulers of flesh and blood became legends of fire and storm. What haunts us is the persistence of these echoes. They do not fade. They repeat again and again, reminding us of something older than our histories allow, something vast enough to leave fingerprints on every culture, yet absent from the chronicles. The silence of history may have erased their names, but mythology still remembers their power, and in those echoes we hear the faintest outline of the empire that once was, an empire hidden, silenced, but never fully forgotten. All across the world there stand buildings that do not belong to the time assigned to them, structures so advanced in design, so precise in execution, that they defy the tools and knowledge of their supposed builders. They rise in defiance of history, silent monuments that whisper of architects whose knowledge was out of place. These are not accidents of construction. They are the fingerprints of a civilization too advanced to fit within the story we are told. Consider the Great Pyramid of Giza. We are told it was built with copper chisels and ropes, thousands of laborers hauling stone across the desert, and yet its base is aligned to true north with astonishing accuracy. Its proportions echo the mathematics of pi and phi, its construction so flawless that modern engineers still marvel. If this was a beginning, why was everything that followed a decline? The pyramids that came later are smaller, cruder, collapsing into ruin. The first attempt was perfection, as if it came not from the Egyptians alone, but from knowledge inherited, knowledge out of place. In India, the Kailasa temple at Ellora was not built stone by stone, but carved downward into solid rock. Entire columns, sanctuaries and sculptures cut from the mountain itself, as though the builders had technology or skill far beyond hammer and chisel. Historians call it devotion, persistence, the labour of generations. But the precision of the work feels different, like the echo of a forgotten method no longer understood. In South America, the ruins of Tiwanaku and Pumapunku stand as enigmas, stones weighing hundreds of tons cut with interlocking grooves, angles so sharp they resemble machine work. And yet the people credited with them left no written record, no explanation of how such feats were possible. The architecture feels displaced, as though it belonged to an age before, an empire erased from the books but not from the earth. Even in Europe, the same whispers appear. Gothic cathedrals rise with spires that scrape the heavens, their stained glass casting cosmic patterns of light. We are told they were built in the medieval period, a time supposedly struggling with famine, plague, and war. Yet the architecture bursts forth suddenly, as if drawn from knowledge preserved in silence. Where did it come from? Was it inspiration, or was it the resurfacing of something older, hidden, waiting to be revealed again? What binds all these structures together is not only their grandeur, but their misplacement. They appear fully formed without the gradual steps we should see. No experimental failures, no primitive prototypes, just sudden brilliance, and then decline. As if the architects were not of their time, but remnants of something older, bringing knowledge forward from an age already erased. The lost architects are not remembered by name. Their blueprints are gone, their tools scattered. Yet their monuments remain, immune to fire, flood, and forgetting. They are the testimony of a people who knew more than they should have, who built in ways we still struggle to understand. They are not simply ruins, they are proof. Proof that history has gaps, and in those gaps lies the empire they tried to erase. Across the ancient world, monuments rise not only toward the heavens, but in harmony with them. Temples, pyramids, stone circles, all placed with such precision that their alignments trace the movements of the stars, the sun, and the moon. We are told these were the work of early sky watchers, farmers marking seasons, priests seeking omens. Yet the accuracy is so profound, so exact, that it often surpasses what their era should have known. These lines in the stars suggest more than coincidence. They hint at knowledge passed down from a forgotten civilization, an empire erased but still whispering through the heavens. The pyramids of Giza stand as the most striking example. Their layout mirrors the three stars of Orion's belt, aligned not only in position but in scale, with shafts inside the Great Pyramid pointing directly to key constellations. This is not guesswork. It is engineering tied to the cosmos itself. How could builders with copper tools and simple sighting methods have achieved such precision? Unless they inherited star maps from an older people, maps far older than the pyramids themselves. Stonehenge, with its massive sarsens and lintels, is not only a circle of stone, it is a calendar. On the summer solstice, the rising sun aligns perfectly with the heel stone, casting light into the heart of the monument. To build such a structure required more than brute force. It demanded generations of observation, mathematics, and knowledge that should not have existed in prehistoric Britain. Was it the work of simple farmers, or the echo of a science carried forward from an empire long gone? In Central America, the Maya built temples that track the equinoxes, solstices, and even the cycles of Venus. At Chichen Itza, the pyramid of Kukulkan casts the shadow of a serpent slithering down its steps precisely on the equinox. Such astronomical mastery was not gradual, it appeared fully formed. Their calendars spanned thousands of years, rivaling modern precision. Where did such knowledge come from, if not from a people who measured time in ways beyond our comprehension? Even in the Andes, the lines of Nazca stretch across the desert, vast geoglyphs only visible from the sky. Many align with solstices and celestial events, as if the builders understood the stars in ways that required not only observation, but a grand design. Yet they left no explanation, no written record, only silence, and patterns too precise to ignore. These alignments repeat across cultures oceans apart. Temples in Cambodia, ziggurats in Mesopotamia, mounds in North America, all reaching for the sky, all fixed to celestial patterns. Could it be coincidence? Perhaps. But coincidence repeated across continents with such accuracy begins to feel less like chance and more like memory. Memory of an empire that measured the heavens with tools now lost, passing its knowledge to those who came after before fading into silence. The lines in the stars are not simply markers of time, they are signatures of a people who understood the cosmos as a map, who built not just for Earth but for eternity. Their empire may have been erased, their names forgotten, but in the sky their memory endures. Every solstice, every rising star, every shadow cast across ancient stone is a reminder. We are not the first to know the heavens. We are only the latest to remember what the forgotten once mastered. Throughout history, rulers have claimed descent from gods, heroes, and ancient kings. Dynasties legitimize their power not by deeds alone, but by bloodlines said to stretch back into the mists of time. At first this seems like vanity, a ruler's attempt to clothe himself in myth. But when the same pattern repeats across civilizations oceans apart, when emperors, pharaohs, and kings all insist their lineage descends from a shadowy past, we are left with a question. Were they simply inventing prestige, or were they preserving the faint memory of a forgotten empire? In Egypt, the pharaohs declared themselves sons of Ra, living gods on earth. Their genealogies trace not just through mortal fathers, but through divine origins, as if their power was a continuation of something older than Egypt itself. The first dynasty spoke of rule handed down by beings they called the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, who governed before the pharaohs of flesh and blood. Were these simply mythical kings, or echoes of rulers from a civilization erased? In Mesopotamia, the Sumerian king list records reigns that stretch into the thousands of years. Some kings are said to have ruled for centuries, even millennia, before a great flood reshaped the world. Scholars dismiss these as exaggerations, symbolic numbers. But what if they are not? What if the text preserves a distorted memory of dynasties belonging not to myth, but to an empire whose very timeline was removed from history? The Chinese emperors too traced their bloodlines to the sons of heaven, divine ancestors whose mandate gave them the right to rule. Japan's emperors claimed descent from Amaterasu, the sun goddess, a lineage said to be unbroken since the dawn of time. In South America, the Inca rulers claimed they were children of the sun, descended from Viracocha, a mysterious teacher who came from across the sea. Everywhere the same refrain: power does not begin here, but comes from a source long forgotten. Even in medieval Europe, noble houses traced their origins to Trojan princes, biblical patriarchs, or ancient conquerors. The Merovingians of France claimed descent from a sea-born being, a mysterious figure who united tribes under his bloodline. The British kings wove their ancestry back to Brutus of Troy, himself a figure half hidden in legend. Were these tales fabrications, or attempts to preserve fragments of a memory older than history itself? Perhaps dynasties insisted on divine or ancient origins not only to legitimize themselves, but because they truly carried echoes of bloodlines that stretched back to an erased age. Perhaps their ancestors had indeed belonged to a civilization wiped from the record, a people whose power was so great it could not be openly remembered, and so their descendants cloak the truth in myth, speaking in symbols of gods, heroes, and sun-born kings. The bloodlines of power remind us that history is not only what is written, but what is claimed. And when rulers across the world in every age insist their origins lie in shadows, we are left with the possibility that the shadows themselves were real, that behind the myth stands an empire erased, yet remembered in blood. Across the world, ancient roads wind through deserts, mountains, and jungles, some leading to cities long abandoned, others vanishing into landscapes where no settlements remain. They are remnants of trade routes, arteries that once connected civilizations. And yet, many of these paths make no sense within the timelines we are given. They are too vast for the cultures that supposedly built them, too direct to be accidents, too advanced for societies described as primitive. They suggest a network of exchange, a system of commerce and knowledge, once maintained by an empire now erased. In South America, the Inca Trail stretches for thousands of miles across mountains and valleys, linking cities, fortresses, and sacred sites. It is often described as a marvel of Inca engineering. But what if the Incas inherited more than they created? Portions of the road appear older than their empire, laid with a skill that seems to belong to a different age. The network is so extensive that it feels as if it once connected not just the Andes, but a larger world beyond. In Africa, across the Sahara, faint tracks and buried roadways suggest commerce far older than the camel caravans of the medieval period. Satellite imagery reveals lines etched into the desert, routes that once carried goods and people before the sands consumed them. Local traditions speak of golden cities and vast markets, thriving hubs now swallowed by the desert. Who were these traders? And what empire did they serve before the dunes buried their memory? The Silk Road of Asia is celebrated as the great link between East and West, flourishing under the Han and later empires. But archaeology suggests earlier networks, traces of goods and artifacts moving between distant lands long before the Silk Road was supposedly established. Chinese silk found in Egyptian tombs, herbs and spices from Asia turning up in Bronze Age Europe, even South American plants appearing in African remains. These exchanges should not have been possible in the eras assigned, unless trade routes already spanned continents, maintained by a civilization later erased from the record. Even in Europe, the Roman roads, straight, enduring, stretching across thousands of miles, are often praised as Rome's greatest achievement. Yet in some places older foundations lie beneath them, as if Rome built upon paths already carved by those who came before. Roads that predate the empire, carrying echoes of a network that once linked forgotten cities. And then there are the sea routes, hinted at in maps and myths, legends of sailors crossing oceans, of lands reached beyond the horizon, of goods exchanged across vast distances. The Phoenicians, Polynesians, and Vikings each carried fragments of this legacy. But were they rediscovering routes once known to a greater empire, an empire whose ships sailed oceans long before the age of recorded exploration? Trade routes are not built by accident. They require organization, power, and vision. They bind distant lands together in a web of exchange. The routes that vanished remind us that where paths exist, civilizations must have once thrived. And when those paths stretch further and deeper than history allows, we hear the whisper of an empire that connected the world and was later erased. Across the world stand stones so massive, so immovable, that their very existence feels like a challenge to the story we've been told. Megaliths, blocks weighing hundreds of tons, carved, lifted, and placed with precision that strains the limits of even modern engineering. We are told that simple tribes with primitive tools dragged them into place, working with ropes and wooden rollers. But when we see these monuments, when we feel their scale, the explanation feels thin. These stones speak of an empire of builders, a civilization of stone, whose power has been erased but whose monuments endure. At Baalbek in Lebanon, 3 colossal blocks known as the Trilithon sit at the base of ancient ruins. Each weighs more than 800 tons, their surfaces smooth, their placement seamless. Above them rise Roman temples, but even Rome, with all its engineering, did not move such giants. The foundation feels older, deeper, as if the Romans built atop the remains of a forgotten empire, inheriting what they could not have created. In South America, the fortress of Sacsayhuaman rises above the city of Cusco. Enormous stones, some weighing over 100 tons, are cut and fitted together with no mortar, their edges locking in jigsaw-like perfection. The Incas are credited, but their own legends tell another story, that the walls were built by those who came before, a race with strength beyond human. The stones themselves whisper of lost knowledge, techniques of quarrying and lifting that have never been explained. Farther south, at Pumapunku, blocks of andesite lie scattered like the bones of giants. They are cut with interlocking grooves and perfect right angles as though shaped by machines. Yet they belong to a culture said to have no writing, no wheels, no advanced tools. Scholars explain them away as coincidence, weathering, or crude chisels. But the precision is undeniable. These stones speak of architects who understood engineering at a level we have yet to rediscover. Even across Europe, the pattern persists. Stonehenge in England, Karnak in France, megalithic tombs across Ireland and Spain, each built with stones so heavy that the very act of moving them defies explanation. We are told these were rituals, acts of devotion. But perhaps they were more. Perhaps they were markers of power, monuments of an empire of stone, their presence meant to endure even when memory was erased. The stones do not speak in words, they speak in silence, in their weight, in their endurance. Empires rise and fall, kings come and go, but the megaliths remain. They outlast fire and flood, erasure and rewriting. They are the fragments of a civilization too vast to forget entirely, yet deliberately hidden from the record. When we stand before them, we are not only facing stones, we are facing time itself, the stubborn persistence of memory carved into earth. An empire of stone may have been erased from the chronicles, but its voice is still here. Heavy, unyielding, undeniable. Proof that something greater once walked this earth, leaving behind monuments too vast for silence to contain. History is often presented as fact, but when we look closer, it begins to feel like a story written not by time itself, but by those who held the pen. Chronicles are never neutral. They are shaped, edited, and rewritten to serve the powers of the moment, and with every edit something is lost, names erased, events shifted, centuries stretched or compressed until the past no longer reflects what truly happened. If an empire once existed beyond the reach of our history books, perhaps it vanished not only in fire or flood, but in ink. Perhaps it was erased by rulers who chose to write the world anew. In ancient Rome, emperors commissioned official histories, rewarding those who flattered them, silencing those who did not. When Nero fell, his likeness was struck from monuments, his memory condemned in an act known as damnatio memoriae. It was not enough to kill him. His story had to be rewritten, his existence obscured. If such erasure could be done to a single man, imagine what could be done to an entire kingdom. The medieval church held the power of manuscripts. Monks copied texts by hand, but not all words survived their ink. Some scrolls were deemed heretical and destroyed, others were rewritten, their original meanings bent to fit doctrine. Whole libraries burned, their knowledge reduced to ash. The Library of Alexandria is the most famous, but it was far from the only one. How much was lost? How much was deliberately removed? If a forgotten empire threatened the authority of church or crown, could it not have been silenced with fire and ink? Even in Asia, dynastic histories were carefully controlled. Chinese emperors ensured that chronicles were edited to portray their reigns as divinely ordained, their enemies as traitors, their victories inevitable. Records of rival dynasties were often destroyed. When whole centuries are curated by those with absolute power, how can we trust the story we inherit? We see the pattern again and again. Kings erasing rivals, dynasties overwriting predecessors, conquerors replacing the names of cities, rewriting laws, rebranding monuments as their own. History is not a neutral memory. It is a tool of control, and tools can cut. They can cut so deeply that entire civilizations vanish into silence. What if the empire they tried to erase was not lost to time alone, but deliberately cut away? What if its chronicles were burned, its monuments reassigned, its stories folded into myth until it no longer threatened the narrative of those who followed? To edit history is to edit memory, and to edit memory is to control identity itself. The phrase history is written by the victors is not just a warning, it is a truth. And in that truth lies a shadow. For if history was edited, then what we read today may be less a record of the past than a reflection of power. Somewhere within the gaps, somewhere beneath the silence, lies the story of an empire erased not by catastrophe, but by choice. In the quiet corners of forgotten monasteries, in the dusty vaults of libraries, in caves sealed for millennia, there exist scrolls that survived when so many others were lost to flame and time. They are fragments, torn and incomplete, their words fading, their meanings obscured. Yet within them lie whispers of kingdoms unnamed, rulers unrecorded, and lands unacknowledged by the histories we are given. These fragile survivors are like cracks in the wall of silence, small openings through which the light of a forgotten dominion still slips. The Dead Sea Scrolls, hidden in desert caves and rediscovered only in the 20th century, shook the world because they revealed versions of stories older than the official ones. But alongside the religious texts, there were fragments of writings that spoke of secret lineages, wars fought in ages unplaced, and teachers whose names do not appear in scripture. Were these merely symbols, or the faintest echoes of a history we were not meant to inherit? In Mesopotamia, cuneiform tablets lay buried in clay jars, only uncovered when archaeologists dug through the ruins of ancient cities. Among the records of trade and harvests are myths of gods and kings whose reigns stretch impossibly long. Some scholars dismiss them as exaggeration, yet others see them as glimpses into an earlier order of rulers, perhaps the memory of an empire wiped from the official story, but preserved in clay. Egypt too holds fragments. Papyrus scrolls found in tombs and temples often carry hymns, rituals, or accounts of daily life. Yet scattered among them are hints of older knowledge, lists of rulers predating the pharaohs, descriptions of lands across the seas, accounts of monuments standing before Egypt was said to rise. These scraps are rarely celebrated. They are locked away, labelled anomalies, their implications quietly ignored. In China, bamboo strips recovered from ancient tombs describe dynasties unmentioned in official records. The texts are fragmentary, their meanings debated, but they hint at rulers before the seer, names erased when the dynastic histories were streamlined to create a seamless flow of power. Why omit them? What threat did they pose to the order of the past? Even in medieval Europe, a few scattered manuscripts slip through the cracks. Chronicles copied by monks sometimes preserve stories of vanished cities, golden empires, or kings who ruled far beyond the timelines allowed. Often these were dismissed as allegory, yet their details, trade routes, measurements, genealogies read more like memory than invention. What makes these scrolls so haunting is that they survived at all. Fires consumed libraries, conquerors burned archives, time reduced parchment to dust. Yet somehow, a few pieces endured. Perhaps by accident, perhaps by design. Each one feels like a message smuggled across centuries, a reminder that not all memory can be silenced. The scrolls that survived are fragile, incomplete, and often overlooked. Yet together they form a chorus. A broken chorus, yes, but one that still hums with the echo of a dominion erased. They remind us that history is not seamless. It is a tapestry full of missing threads. And in those missing threads lies the memory of an empire that refused to be forgotten entirely. Symbols carved into stone, etched on clay, painted onto walls, and inscribed on tablets stare back at us from the depths of time. They are marks left by hands that lived thousands of years ago, signs meant to speak across generations. And yet, so many of these symbols remain silent, languages we cannot read, scripts we cannot decode, messages from an age that seems to slip just beyond our reach. These are not random scratches. They are records. They are the voices of an empire that spoke in symbols, and whose words we no longer understand. One of the greatest enigmas is the script of the Indus Valley civilization. Thousands of seals and tablets carry short lines of characters, often accompanied by images of animals and gods. Despite decades of effort, no one has ever cracked their meaning. Were they names, prayers, trade records, or do they conceal the story of a people whose entire civilization was erased from memory? We call it a civilization without writing, yet their symbols stare at us defiantly, demanding to be heard. Another mystery lies in the glyphs of Easter Island, known as Rongorongo. Carved on wooden tablets, these looping signs are unlike any other script in the Pacific. When Europeans arrived, the knowledge of how to read them was already lost. Local tradition insisted that they preserve the wisdom of ancestors, knowledge passed from a time before disaster struck the island. Today they remain undeciphered, their meaning locked away, like a library sealed by silence. The Phaistos disc of Crete is another haunting artifact. Fired clay stamped with spiraling symbols, unique and unlike any other script. Some say it is a game, others a ritual chant. But perhaps it is something far greater, a fragment of a written language belonging to a people who vanished, their empire swallowed, leaving behind only this single voice spinning in clay. Across the Americas, symbols carved into rocks by ancient hands cover cliffs and canyon walls. Petroglyphs show spirals, suns, stars, and beings that look both human and not. Scholars label them art or ritual symbols. But perhaps they are records. Perhaps they describe events now lost, catastrophes, migrations, or memories of contact with an empire long erased. The patterns repeat in ways too precise to dismiss. They feel like language even if our ears are deaf to its sound. Even Egypt, land of hieroglyphs, holds its mysteries. While we celebrate the Rosetta Stone for unlocking the script of the pharaohs, there are older marks, older codes found on pottery and artifacts that do not fit within the pharaonic timeline. They appear briefly, then vanish, as though belonging to another age. Were they remnants of an earlier language, one tied to the erased kingdom whose memory Egypt inherited but did not fully preserve? What connects all of these is the silence. Languages do not usually vanish completely. They evolve, they shift, but they leave traces. Yet here we find entire scripts severed, entire voices cut off. It is as if the thread was deliberately broken, as if the empire that spoke these words was not only destroyed, but its language silenced so that no one could remember it. Still, the symbols endure. They wait on stone and clay, whispering in patterns we cannot hear. And perhaps that is the most haunting part. They remind us that memory can be buried, but not erased entirely. The empire that spoke in symbols may be gone, but its words remain, scattered, fragments of a voice too strong to disappear. If we could read them, perhaps the story of the erased kingdom would return in full. Until then, The silence of these scripts is the silence of history itself, daring us to listen harder. History often tells us that empires fall slowly. We are taught that decline comes through decades of corruption, famine, invasion, or disease. But when we look closer, we find something stranger. Civilizations that do not decline at all. They vanish. They leave behind half-finished monuments, cities abandoned in haste, records that break off mid-sentence. Their people scatter, their language fades, and their power dissolves in the span of a single generation. These are collapses that never made sense. Collapses that suggest not natural decline, but deliberate erasure. Take the Maya, for instance. For centuries, they built cities of stone, carved monuments that charted the heavens, and created one of the most precise calendars in history. Then, suddenly, in the 9th century, their great cities were abandoned. Temples stood empty, plazas silent. There was no final war that historians can agree upon, no great plague to sweep them away. The people remained, but their world order collapsed almost overnight. Why? Some point to drought, some to internal strife, but the speed feels unnatural, as though something larger forced their disappearance, as though their empire was silenced. In Mesopotamia, the Akkadian Empire rose to dominate vast stretches of land. They pioneered administration, trade, and organized rule on a scale never seen before. And then, collapse. Within a century, the empire unraveled, leaving behind only fragments. Official explanations speak of climate shifts, invasions, or rebellion. Yet the suddenness, the scale, and the near-complete loss of their culture feel like more than chance. It is as though the empire itself was targeted by history, cut from memory by some unseen hand. Closer to the Mediterranean, the Mycenaeans of Greece thrived, building palaces and commanding trade routes across the Aegean. They dominated their world, then disappeared so thoroughly that even writing was forgotten. The centuries that followed were labelled the Greek Dark Ages, as if a curtain had been pulled across memory itself. How could a people capable of such complexity dissolve into silence so completely? Unless their fall was not simply a collapse, but a cover-up. Even in the Andes, Tiwanaku stands as a riddle. A vast city of precision-carved stone, it flourished high in the mountains, ruling an empire that touched much of South America. Then, like the Maya, it was abandoned in sudden silence. No record of conquest, no epic tales of downfall. Just disappearance. As if the empire itself was meant to be forgotten. And then there are the phantom collapses that historians still cannot explain. The sea peoples who swept across the Mediterranean, leaving destruction in their wake before vanishing as quickly as they appeared. The Harappan civilization of the Indus Valley, with its organized streets and advanced sanitation, crumbling without clear reason. These collapses feel like more than coincidence. They feel like chapters torn from a book, their endings rewritten to fit the story we are allowed to know. When an empire vanishes overnight, it raises questions too dangerous for history to answer. Where did the people go? Why were their stories silenced? And who benefits from forgetting them? The silence that follows such collapses is heavier than ruin. It is deliberate. It is as though a hand has swept across the timeline, erasing names, erasing memories, leaving only ruins to whisper of what once was. When one empire falls, another often rises in its place. But what if some civilization did not rise from their own brilliance alone, but from the bones of something far older? What if they inherited not only the land, but the roads, the temples, the knowledge of an empire that had already been erased? These inheritors of silence built their power upon ruins, their foundations resting on stones not their own, their myths echoing with memories they did not create. In Egypt we marvel at the pyramids and temples, yet even the Egyptians themselves spoke of rulers before them, the Shemsu-Hor, the followers of Horus who reigned in an age now lost. The dynasties of pharaohs claimed their legacy, but the monuments suggest something deeper. The Great Pyramid, unmatched by anything that followed, feels more like inheritance than innovation. The Egyptians became the guardians of knowledge already ancient when their civilization began. They built their glory upon foundations they did not lay. The Incas too inherited silence. When the Spanish arrived in South America, the Incas were described as masters of empire, builders of fortresses and roads. Yet they themselves admitted that many of the most astounding works, the Cyclopean walls of Sacsayhuaman, the precision blocks of Ollantaytambo, were not theirs. They spoke of a race of builders who came before, giants or gods, whose works they simply adopted. The Inca Empire was powerful, yes, but its greatest wonders were echoes of an older world. In Mesopotamia, the Babylonians inherited myths and sciences from Sumer. They carried forward cuneiform, astronomy, and law codes, claiming them as their own. But the Sumerians themselves told of knowledge given to them by those who came before, rulers whose reign stretched back into impossible time. Was Babylon truly the innovator, or just the inheritor of something already erased? Even in medieval Europe, the pattern repeats. Roman roads cut through hills and valleys, but beneath them, archaeologists sometimes find traces of older paths, older foundations. The Romans are praised as master builders, yet much of what they built was on the bones of others. When the empire collapsed, medieval kingdoms inherited its ruins, repurposing temples into churches, amphitheatres into fortresses. Layer upon layer of inheritance, each new ruler building upon the silence left by the last. In Asia, the Khmer Empire rose in Cambodia, leaving behind Angkor Wat, a masterpiece of architecture and cosmic alignment. But the Khmer inherited much of their cosmology and design from older civilizations of India, and India itself often spoke of its knowledge as ancient, handed down from ages before human memory. Again and again, civilizations take up the torch of forgotten empires, carrying forward fragments while burying the rest. What is most haunting is how those inheritors rarely claim innovation. They speak of teachers, gods, ancestors who gave them wisdom. They admit their greatest wonders are not their own. It is only modern historians who rewrite the story, crediting civilizations with feats they may never have achieved alone. The inheritors of silence are like children playing among ruins. They adapt, they claim, they build anew, but beneath their glory lies something deeper, something erased. They remind us that history is not always progress but inheritance. And when we look at the wonders of the world, we must ask, whose hands truly built them? And why were their names stripped from memory? If history is a tapestry, then some threads have been cut deliberately. We imagine time as a story faithfully carried forward, but the truth is more fragile. There are powers who have decided what is remembered, and more importantly, what is forgotten. When we look at the ruins that don't fit, the myths that repeat across cultures, the artifacts that appear centuries too soon, we begin to sense a pattern. These are not accidents of history, they are the scars of a great cover-up, a cover-up designed to erase an empire from memory. Why would such a cover-up occur? The answer lies in power. History is not neutral, it is a weapon. To control the past is to control the present, and to shape the past is to dictate the future. If an empire once existed whose reach spanned oceans, whose knowledge rivaled or surpassed our own, then those who came after would face a problem. How do you build legitimacy when you stand in the shadow of such greatness? How do you claim divinity, authority, or supremacy if the stones prove you are only an inheritor? The solution is silence. Remove the memory, burn the texts, rewrite the chronicles, attribute the monuments to simpler peoples, transform kings into gods, and empires into myths. We see this in the fate of libraries. The flames of Alexandria are the most famous, but they were not unique. The conqueror's torch was often turned upon archives, not only to humiliate, but to erase. Knowledge, too dangerous to allow into the future, was consumed. Scrolls that carried the memory of erased dynasties turned to ash, and once the records were gone, the narrative could be rewritten however the victors pleased. We see it in the myths that survived. Legends of floods, fire, and gods who walked among men may have once been histories, stripped of their context. By reducing them to allegory, Rulers could preserve fragments of memory while burying their meaning. To say these were stories is to sever them from the possibility that they were truth. And so the memory of the empire dissolved into fairy tale. We see it in the dismissals of scholars. Even today, when an artifact appears out of place, it is locked away, called a forgery, labelled an anomaly. When ruins contradict the timeline, they are explained away as accidents or coincidences. This is not simply caution, it is the echo of the cover-up, a tradition of silence inherited from centuries of deliberate forgetting. The question is not whether the cover-up happened. The evidence is all around us, in the ruins, in the scrolls, in the myths that refuse to fade. The question is who orchestrated it and why. Was it the conquerors of the forgotten empire determined to bury their rivals? Was it later rulers crafting seamless histories to justify their thrones? Or was it something more enduring, a secret lineage of power that understood the truth could never be allowed into the light? The great cover-up reminds us that history is not only lost, it is taken. Erasure is not always the work of time, but of hands with motive. And if they worked so hard to silence this empire, then perhaps its memory carries a truth too dangerous to reveal. The stones still whisper, the myths still echo, the fragments still surface. But the silence that surrounds them is not natural, it is deliberate. And that, more than anything, tells us that the empire they tried to erase was real. Across jungles, mountains, and forgotten plains, temples rise in places where they should not exist. Sacred sites carved with impossible artistry, aligned to the heavens, built on foundations that seem to belong to another world entirely. Historians struggle to place them, assigning them to cultures with little evidence, fitting them into timelines that cannot explain their scale or precision. These are the temples that shouldn't be there, monuments misplaced in history, stubborn reminders of a forgotten empire. Deep in the Cambodian jungle, Angkor Wat stretches across the land like a stone mandala. Its towers mirror the peaks of Mount Meru, its galleries chart the cosmos, its design resonates with astronomical precision. Scholars say it was built by the Khmer in the 12th century, a feat of human devotion. But how does such grandeur erupt fully formed, with no smaller steps of practice leading up to it? How does a kingdom suddenly master both architecture and astronomy at once? The temple feels less like an invention and more like an inheritance, knowledge handed down from a source the history books refuse to name. In India, the Kailasa temple at Ellora is another impossibility. Carved from a single mountain, it was not constructed stone by stone, but hollowed from above as if sculpted by giants. Its scale rivals entire cathedrals, yet it carries details of artistry so fine they seem beyond the reach of hammer and chisel. To create it, thousands of tons of rock would have had to be removed with precision no one can fully explain. Legend says it was built in a single night by divine beings. Perhaps this was no fantasy, but the distorted memory of knowledge now erased. Travel west to Malta, where megalithic temples stand older than the pyramids. Their stones weigh tons, their designs align with solstices, yet they were built by people who supposedly had no writing, no wheel, no advanced tools. Scholars struggle to explain who built them, offering guesses of small island tribes. But the scale of these temples tells another story. They feel like outposts of something larger, fragments of a network once spread across the world. Farther still, in the deserts of Sudan, stand the pyramids of Meroe. Smaller than their Egyptian cousins, but far more numerous, they suggest a culture steeped in the same architectural traditions, yet cut off from their supposed origin. How did knowledge leap so far south into lands historians say were primitive at the time? Unless both Egypt and Meroe were drawing from the memory of a greater, older empire now erased. Even in the Americas, sacred sites defy explanation. At Teotihuacan in Mexico, the pyramids of the sun and moon rise with geometric precision, aligned to celestial events. Yet the city was already ancient when the Aztecs discovered it. So old they called it the City of the Gods, built by giants in an age before memory. The builders remain unknown, their empire erased, their temples still standing. What makes these sacred sites so haunting is not only their placement but their persistence. They refuse to vanish. They rise out of jungles, deserts and mountains as if to remind us that something greater once walked here, something whose knowledge was so advanced it still confounds us today. These temples do not belong to the people we assign them to. They belong to the silence, to the empire that left them behind, hoping their stones would speak when words were erased. All across the ancient world we find traces of tools and techniques that should not exist. Artifacts cut with precision beyond bronze or stone, carving so exact they suggest machines, relics that carry the fingerprints of technologies far older than the timelines we are given. We are told these are anomalies, dismissed as accidents or coincidences. Yet when gathered together, they form a pattern too strong to ignore. They suggest that the people we call primitive were not so primitive at all. They suggest an empire equipped with tools we can barely understand, tools that should not have existed. At Pumapunku in Bolivia, blocks of andesite are carved with sharp angles, interlocking joints, and drill holes so precise they appear machine-made. The site is dated to a culture without writing, wheels, or iron tools, and yet the stones resemble prefabricated pieces as if part of a massive puzzle. The official explanation that they were shaped with stone hammers rings hollow. The evidence whispers of lost technology, advanced methods handed down from a forgotten empire before vanishing again into silence. In Egypt, saw marks appear on granite sarcophagi, cut so smooth and even they suggest high-speed drills. The unfinished obelisk at Aswan shows grooves as though carved not with copper chisels but with a mechanical tool, yet Egyptologists insist the builders relied only on basic implements. The possibility of advanced tools is ignored because it does not fit the narrative, but the stone does not lie. Its scars record a method more powerful than history allows. In Mesopotamia, tiny artifacts known as the Baghdad batteries hint at the possibility of electricity thousands of years ago. Clay jars with copper cylinders and iron rods, when filled with an acidic liquid, produce a small charge. Were they used for electroplating, for medicine, or were they remnants of a technology once widespread, later forgotten? If so, what else might have existed in the empire that first discovered it? Even stranger are the maps and models that appear out of place. In Colombia, small gold figurines resemble modern airplanes, complete with wings and tails. Scholars call them stylized insects, but their aerodynamic shapes suggest otherwise, as if modeled on machines no one in that era should have known. In India, ancient texts describe vimanas, flying chariots of the gods, machines that traverse the skies and even space. Are these mere myths, or distorted memories of technologies once real? The mystery deepens with evidence of metallurgy. In parts of India, iron pillars stand for thousands of years without rusting, their composition suggesting knowledge of alloys beyond what should have been possible. In South America, artifacts contain traces of platinum, a metal requiring smelting at temperatures supposedly unattainable to pre-Columbian peoples. Everywhere we look, fragments of impossible skill emerge, scattered like the remnants of a toolkit lost in time. What makes these discoveries so unsettling is the silence surrounding them. Museums often store the most baffling artifacts away, labeling them anomalies, curiosities, or mistakes. Yet when viewed together, they form the outline of something far greater, the remnants of advanced technology belonging to a civilization erased. The tools they shouldn't have had are more than relics. They are testimonies. They remind us that humanity has walked this path before, reaching heights of skill and knowledge before falling into silence. The empire that wielded them may be gone, but the stones, metals, and artifacts endure. They whisper that progress is not linear, that history is not seamless, and that perhaps we are only relearning what was already known long ago. There's a strange phenomenon in human history, one rarely discussed yet impossible to ignore. Entire civilizations rise, flourish, and fall. And when they fall, it is as if the world itself forgets them. Not merely in ruins, not merely in silence, but in total amnesia. The knowledge that once defined them vanishes. Their achievements are no longer remembered, and their names are reduced to myth or lost altogether. This is not simply the erosion of time, this is something deeper. A cultural forgetting so complete that it feels deliberate, as though humanity itself was forced to erase a memory too dangerous to keep. Consider the fall of the Indus Valley. Their cities were among the most advanced of the ancient world. Gridded streets, indoor plumbing, advanced drainage systems, even standardized weights and measures. And yet, when their civilization collapsed, not only did their cities disappear, but so did their writing. Entire scripts, thousands of inscriptions, suddenly became unreadable to their descendants. How does such forgetting happen? How does an entire culture lose the key to its own language unless something, someone, ensures that it is no longer remembered? We see the same in Greece after the fall of the Mycenaeans. For centuries, they used linear B script to record trade, law, and ritual. But when their world collapsed, the script was abandoned. The next era, the so-called Greek Dark Ages, forgot writing altogether. How could a people capable of palaces and fleets suddenly lose literacy, only to rediscover it centuries later in a different form? It is as if memory was severed, a deliberate break in the continuity of knowledge. In Mesoamerica, the Maya were masters of astronomy and mathematics, their calendar stretching across thousands of years. But when their cities were abandoned, much of this knowledge disappeared. By the time the Spanish arrived, much of their cosmology had already been forgotten. The survivors lived in the shadows of temples they no longer fully understood, their sacred knowledge scattered like dust in the wind. It was not simply loss, it was amnesia. Cultural forgetting is not always sudden. Sometimes it happens gradually, as new rulers overwrite the past. Conquerors destroy the monuments of those who came before, rename cities, burn records, and insert themselves as the beginning of time. The past is not only erased, it is rewritten. The Babylonians built atop the ruins of Sumer. The Romans claimed the works of Greece. Medieval Europe copied fragments of Rome while burying its true complexity in silence. With each layer, memory fades, and what remains is a story shaped not by truth, but by the needs of power. But sometimes, the forgetting feels too precise to be chance. How do entire technologies vanish without trace? How does metallurgy regress, architecture decline, astronomy collapse into myth? It is as though humanity itself has been reset, as though some unseen hand wiped the slate clean. Myths speak of floods, of fire, of catastrophes that ended the world. Perhaps these are not only memories of disaster, but metaphors for forgetting itself, the drowning of memory, the burning of knowledge, the darkness of silence. When the world forgets, it is not only history that is lost, identity dissolves, continuity breaks. Humanity begins again as if from nothing, standing on ruins it no longer understands. And yet, the stones remain. The fragments linger. Enough to remind us that forgetting is not final. Enough to hint that we are living in the afterglow of an empire erased. The silence of cultural amnesia is heavy, but it is not complete. For every forgotten script, every buried temple, every ruined city, there remains a trace. A whisper in stone, a symbol carved into walls, a myth too persistent to die. The world may forget, but the past does not. It waits, patient, beneath the silence. Every culture tells stories. They pass them down in whispers by the fire, in songs sung to children, in tales repeated so often they become as natural as breathing. We call them fairy tales, folklore, myths, imaginative creations meant to entertain or instruct. But what if these stories are not inventions at all? What if they are fragments of memory, distorted over centuries, yet carrying the bones of truth? What if the kingdoms that haunt our myths are echoes of a forgotten empire, erased from history but surviving in story? Consider the tale of Atlantis, told by Plato as a parable of hubris and divine punishment. For centuries it has been dismissed as allegory, a philosophical fable. Yet why does it feel so specific? a vast kingdom, wealthy beyond measure, swallowed by the sea in a single night. Plato claimed he drew the tale from Egyptian priests, who in turn spoke of ages long before Greece. Could Atlantis be more than a moral story? Could it be the broken memory of a real empire, its fall preserved in myth because history refused to hold its name? The same pattern repeats across the world. In Celtic lore there are stories of Tir na Nog, the land of eternal youth lying far across the sea. In Sumerian myth, Dilmun was a paradise where humanity first began, a kingdom lost to time. In Polynesia, stories speak of Hawaii, the ancestral homeland across the waves where the first voyagers came from and where souls return after death. Different names, different details, but always a kingdom beyond reach, half remembered, half erased. Even our fairy tales echo strangely. Giants who once walked the earth, dwarves who lived beneath mountains, shaping metals with unmatched skill, beings who gifted fire, who taught agriculture, who gave laws to humanity. We call them fantasy, yet they mirror the roles of real rulers and culture bringers. Were these figures truly imagined or distorted memories of a people so advanced they seemed godlike to those who inherited their world? Folklore often hides in plain sight. Take the recurring motif of great floods, of towers that reach the heavens, of golden ages followed by catastrophe. These are not isolated inventions, they appear in every corner of the world. It is as though humanity carries a shared trauma, a memory too deep to be erased, yet too dangerous to preserve in chronicles. So it survived in stories, softened into tales for children, yet always whispering of something lost. Even our monsters may be echoes. Dragons guarding hoards of treasure, serpents rising from the sea, beings of fire or stone who threatened humanity. Perhaps these were not imagined horrors, but symbolic retellings of real struggles. Wars with rival peoples, confrontations with forces of nature, encounters with remnants of the forgotten empire. Over time, details blurred, but the core endured. There was once a kingdom unlike any other, and when it fell, its shadow lingered in story. The persistence of these myths is what makes them so haunting. If they were only fantasy, why do they repeat across oceans? Why do they carry the same themes, the same warnings, the same lost kingdoms? It is as though humanity is trying to remember but can only speak in allegory. The fairy tales and folklore that survive are not simply entertainment, they are memory in disguise. The kingdom that haunts our myths may never be written in history books, but it lives in story. In every tale of a golden land beyond reach, in every whisper of a paradise lost, we are hearing the faint echoes of the empire erased. And though scholars dismiss them, the stories remain, haunting us, reminding us, refusing to die. When we ask why this empire was erased, we must first ask what it threatened. Empires are not forgotten by accident. They are removed because their memory is dangerous. Their very existence unsettles the order of those who follow. To erase such a kingdom is not merely to strike it from the record, it is to protect a narrative that grants legitimacy to rulers, to nations, to entire civilizations that would crumble if the truth were revealed. Imagine an empire so vast it spanned oceans, so advanced it built monuments we still cannot replicate, so enduring its influence touched every corner of the world. If this memory survived, what would it mean for those who came later? The pharaohs who claimed divinity would be seen as pretenders. The kings who boasted of founding cities would be revealed as squatters in ruins not their own. The nations that claimed to be the first would be stripped of their glory. History itself would unravel and the power built upon it would collapse. This is why erasure was necessary, to preserve the illusion of beginnings, to allow new dynasties to stand as the dawn of civilization, not as inheritors of something far greater. The memory of the lost empire was too threatening, too destabilizing. It had to be silenced. We see the pattern in myths of conquest. New rulers often claimed to have built what they merely inherited. Rome took the works of Greece and called them its own. The Inca adopted the megaliths of earlier builders and folded them into their empire. The Egyptians built atop ruins that may have predated them. Each time the story was rewritten, each time the true builders pushed deeper into shadow. This is not coincidence, it is a strategy. But the threat was not only political, it was philosophical. If humanity had risen before, if an empire had already reached heights of knowledge, then progress is not inevitable. Civilization is not a straight line upward. It can fall, collapse, and be forgotten. To admit this is to admit vulnerability, fragility. It is to admit that our own world can vanish just as easily. And rulers do not want their subjects to think of fragility. They want permanence, destiny, inevitability. Erasure ensures that the past serves their authority, not undermines it. There is another possibility, more unsettling still. Perhaps the lost empire's knowledge was not only advanced but dangerous. Perhaps it challenged not only political legitimacy, but the worldview itself. If they mastered technologies, sciences, or truths that contradicted the later order, truths about the stars, about humanity, about the very origins of life, then their memory could not be allowed to survive. The empire may have been silenced, not simply because it was great, but because it revealed too much. The deliberate erasure of this kingdom was not the act of chaos, but of control. It was a calculated effort to shape humanity's memory, to ensure that the past aligned with the needs of the present. And it succeeded, at least for a time. For though the chronicles were burned, the monuments reassigned, the myths reduced to fable, fragments remain. Enough to remind us that the cover-up was real. Enough to remind us that something vast once stood here. The empire was erased because it threatened the story we are told about ourselves. And perhaps, in a way, it still does. For if we admit its existence, we must admit that history is not as we believe. And in that moment, the narrative collapses, and we are left facing the silence and the truth of what was taken from us. Scattered in museums, locked in basements, or buried beneath layers of earth, there are bones that refuse to conform, skeletons unearthed in the wrong strata, remains that suggest forms or lifespans outside the accepted order, traces of human presence far older than the textbooks allow. Archaeologists often label them anomalies, curiosities, or even hoaxes. But when the anomalies accumulate, they begin to tell a different story. They become the bones that whisper of a forgotten empire, an age erased yet not entirely silenced. In North America, footprints preserved in volcanic ash at White Sands, New Mexico, shock the academic world. They were dated to over 20,000 years ago, long before humans were supposed to have crossed into the continent. The finding unsettled the timeline of migration so deeply that many resisted its implications. Yet there they are, human prints, delicate and undeniable, treading across the surface of deep time. If people walked here so long ago, what civilizations might have risen and fallen before the record begins? Elsewhere, skeletons have been unearthed that strain belief. At sites across Asia and Europe, human remains show evidence of gigantism, not individuals, but patterns suggesting larger frames than modern humans. Legends speak of giants who walked the earth, dismissed as fantasy. But what if these stories were distorted memories of real people, erased when their presence no longer fit the narrative of progress? Their bones, too large to ignore, are quietly filed away or dismissed as abnormalities, yet they keep surfacing, like ghosts that will not rest. In South America, elongated skulls found in Peru and Bolivia suggest a practice far older and stranger than simple ritual deformation. Some are natural, their cranial volume greater than that of ordinary humans. Scholars rush to label them curiosities, rare genetic quirks, but the consistency of their appearance, the way they cluster around ancient centers of power, feels deliberate, as though they belong to a class of rulers, remembered in myth as demigods or kings. Were these the descendants of the lost empire, their bones carrying the last physical trace of erased bloodlines? Even more unsettling are the remains that reveal lifespans beyond the ordinary. In some traditions, skeletal evidence hints at individuals who lived longer than what we believe human biology allows.
Combined with texts like the Sumerian king list, where rulers reigned for hundreds of years, such findings challenge our assumptions. Were they exaggerations or the distorted memory of a time when humanity itself was different?
And then there are the artifacts found alongside bones, tools and objects that should not exist in their layers. A hammer encased in stone millions of years old. Metal spheres carved with grooves, discovered in strata, too ancient to explain. Each time they are dismissed as mistakes, as intrusions from later ages. Yet they recur again and again, as if reminding us that the bones of forgotten peoples lie deeper in time than we allow. The silence around these discoveries is louder than the finds themselves. Museums quietly remove them from display. Journals dismiss them in footnotes. Yet they keep emerging, stubborn, undeniable. The bones tell a story of humanity older, stranger, and more complex than we have been told. A story of people erased, of an empire buried, of a past deliberately severed from memory. We are taught to see bones as evidence of life, but they are also evidence of silence. Each misplaced skeleton, each anomalous skull, each print in ancient ash, is a voice speaking across time. We were here. We lived. We built. And we were erased. No matter how much effort has been spent to erase it, the memory of the forgotten empire refuses to die. Its shadow lingers in ruins that defy explanation, in myths that repeat across cultures, in artifacts that surface where they should not exist. It is as if the earth itself conspires to reveal fragments, as though the silence imposed on this empire can never be absolute. The erasure was deliberate, yes, but the past has a way of pushing through the cracks. Again and again, the empire rises in whispers, demanding to be remembered. Each generation rediscovers anomalies. A forgotten manuscript emerges from an archive, its words hinting at a history older than our own. A temple rises from beneath the jungle, its precision mocking the idea that it was the work of simple farmers. A satellite scan reveals streets hidden under desert sands, cities stretching further than anyone believed possible. And suddenly, the official timeline trembles. Each discovery is explained away, tucked neatly into familiar narratives, but the fragments pile higher until silence itself begins to collapse. The empire's presence is stubborn in mythology. We tell children fairy tales of golden cities, of gods who ruled before men, of floods and fires that ended the world. Scholars smile at the fantasy, but the stories refuse to fade. They pass through centuries, reshaped but not erased, like memory encoded in the collective mind of humanity. It is as if the people who lived through the fall whispered across generations, "Remember us." And even when their names were lost, the story endured. Its presence also lingers in our technologies and ideas. How is it that ancient builders aligned monuments with the solstices so precisely, or carved blocks so finely, that even today we cannot replicate their work with ease? How is it that mathematics and astronomy appear fully formed in the earliest civilizations, as if inherited rather than invented? The knowledge feels older than the cultures credited with it, like fragments carried forward from a world already gone. Even in modern times, the empire resurfaces in unexpected ways. Divers find megalithic structures beneath the sea, where no city should ever have stood. Explorers stumble across cave paintings depicting figures and machines that should not exist. Farmers ploughing fields unearth tools of alloys they cannot explain. These are not accidents, they are reminders. The past cannot be erased completely, no matter how fierce the cover-up. The persistence of these traces tells us something vital. The empire was too vast, too influential to vanish entirely. Its memory seeps through the cracks of history like water through stone. The erasers did their work well. Most people will never question the official story. But for those who listen, for those who notice the fragments, the voice of the empire is still there. And perhaps that is the ultimate irony. By trying so hard to silence it, those who erased it made its absence louder. The gaps in history, the anomalies in ruins, the myths that refuse to die, all point back to the same truth. Something enormous once stood here, and it refuses to be forgotten. The empire that refuses to die lives on in our questions, in our unease, in the feeling that the story of humanity is incomplete. We sense it in the weight of stones, in the persistence of legends, in the silence between the lines of history. And as long as the traces remain, its memory will endure. Buried, fragmented, hidden, but never gone. In our age of satellites, sonar and archaeology, the forgotten empire is stirring again. What was once hidden beneath sand, jungle and sea is being uncovered with tools the ancients could never have imagined. Yet in a strange twist, what we find often matches what the myths have whispered all along. It is as though modern science, reluctantly and piece by piece, is awakening memories that humanity has carried in silence for thousands of years. The return of the forgotten is not dramatic. It comes in fragments, in discoveries that slip into headlines for a day before vanishing. But taken together, they form a picture too powerful to ignore. In the jungles of Guatemala, LiDAR technology has revealed entire cities sprawling beneath the canopy, roads, temples, palaces, vast complexes hidden for centuries. Historians scramble to fit them into the Maya timeline, but their sheer scale suggests a level of organization greater than once believed. Were the Maya inheriting these structures from an older civilization, or are these the faint remains of the erased empire resurfacing step by step? In the Sahara, satellite scans show faint outlines of rivers, roads, and buried settlements beneath endless dunes. What was once desert was once fertile land, teeming with life. Legends of golden cities swallowed by sand suddenly feel less like fantasy. Each new image suggests that the Sahara hides not emptiness, but memory, a memory waiting to rise. Beneath the seas, divers continue to uncover ruins that should not exist. Off the coast of Japan, the Yonaguni structures step down like pyramids into the ocean. In the Gulf of Cambay in India, sonar has revealed city-like remains buried deep underwater, older than any known civilization. Myths of floods and drowned kingdoms align with these discoveries, as though the stories passed down were simply waiting for us to catch up. Even within museums, fragments whisper. Artifacts once dismissed as forgeries are re-examined, their authenticity confirmed. Ancient maps that showed coastlines long before discovery are compared with satellite images and found to be uncannily accurate. Scrolls once overlooked are translated again, revealing details of kingdoms no one remembers. Each rediscovery is a spark, illuminating the shadows where the empire's memory still hides. What is most haunting is how these discoveries resonate with us. They feel familiar, as though striking chords buried deep in our collective memory. When we hear of lost cities beneath the jungle or temples rising from the sea, something within us stirs. Perhaps because the story of the erased empire still lingers in our unconscious, waiting to be remembered. Perhaps because it is not truly forgotten, it is simply waiting for us to listen. The return of the forgotten does not come with fanfare. It comes in quiet revelations, in the unease of scholars, in the persistence of anomalies. It comes in the realization that history is not a straight line, but a broken circle, and each new fragment uncovered brings us closer to seeing the whole. The empire that was erased is still here, buried beneath sand, stone, and sea, and in our time it is stirring again. Not fully, not yet, but enough to remind us that silence cannot hold forever. The truth waits, and when it emerges, it will rewrite everything we thought we knew. For centuries, the past has been buried. Stones pushed beneath sand, scrolls burned to ash, stories reduced to myth. And yet, no matter how deep the silence, the truth rises again. It comes in fragments, in ruins uncovered, in symbols rediscovered, in memories that echo across cultures. It comes in myths that refuse to fade, in artifacts that appear where they should not, in questions that history cannot answer. The silence breaks because the past refuses to stay hidden. Every time a jungle is cleared and a forgotten city is revealed, the silence cracks. Every time satellites trace the shadow of roads beneath deserts, the silence falters. Every time divers touch the stones of temples drowned beneath the waves, the silence collapses. The erasure was deliberate, the cover-up precise, but memory cannot be destroyed. It waits, patient, persistent, and it always finds a way to speak again. The truth lingers because it belongs to us. We carry it in our stories, in our symbols, even in our dreams. When we hear of lost empires, when we stand before ruins too vast for their supposed builders, something within us stirs, a recognition, a pull, as if some part of us remembers what history has tried to erase. The silence breaks not only in the world outside, but in the world within. We are the keepers of memory, even when we do not realize it. And perhaps that is the greatest secret. The past is not lost, it is suppressed. It is hidden in plain sight, scattered across our world like a puzzle. And every time we ask, every time we wonder, every time we refuse to accept the official story, another piece falls back into place. The silence breaks not only through discovery, but through us, through those who dare to listen. The empire they tried to erase still speaks. It speaks in the stones, in the stars, in the myths that echo across time, and it speaks through you when you refuse to forget, when you choose to wonder, when you follow the threads others ignore. The silence breaks because truth cannot be contained forever. It will always rise. If this journey has moved you, stay with us. Watch more of our stories and let the mysteries of history guide you deeper into the silence that waits to be broken. Subscribe to Bedtime Historians so you never miss the truths still hiding in the shadows. Like this video if it stirred something within you. Share it with those who dare to wonder, and add your voice in the comments, because every thought, every question, every memory shared brings us closer to uncovering what was taken from us. The silence has held for centuries, but here, now, together, we break it, and in the echoes we remember. The silence of history is heavy, but together we can break it. If this story awakened question within you, don't let them fade. Stay with us. There are more mysteries waiting, more truths buried just beneath the surface. Watch our other videos, and let the journey carry you deeper. Subscribe to Bedtime Historians so you never miss the next hidden chapter. Like this video if it stirred something inside you. Share it with others who dare to wonder, and add your voice in the comments below, because every thought, every question, every reflection brings us closer to the truth. The past refuses to stay buried, and with your help, neither will we.